Forget the nativity scenes made of porcelain. Forget the soft candlelight, the clean straw, the serene expressions of a couple at peace with the world. What you are about to witness is the real Bethlehem, raw, cold, overwhelmed, and smelling of animals and desperate human need on the most consequential night in human history. This is not a story that happened in golden light. It happened in darkness, in stone, in the kind of poverty that leaves marks on the body. It is 4 BC. The month is December. The elevation here is 2,500 feet above sea level in the Judean highlands, and tonight the temperature will drop to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. There is no shelter from the east wind that sweeps down from the Judean desert carrying cold that cuts through even the thickest wool cloak. The streets of Bethlehem are paved with limestone rubble. The alleys between houses are 5 feet wide, dark as pitch, filled with the debris of daily life, broken pottery, animal dung pressed flat by foot traffic, the bones of last night's meal thrown from a doorway. This is what the streets smell like. This is what they look like when you put your lamp down close to the ground. Bethlehem in 4 BC is not a city. It is a village. Historical estimates place its permanent population between 300 and 1,000 people. A tight community of farmers and shepherds built entirely from the pale limestone of these ridges, known throughout Judea for one thing above all others, the breeding and supply of temple sacrificial lambs. The pastures surrounding this village feed the religious economy of Jerusalem, 5 miles to the north. These are not wealthy people. These are people living at the margins of subsistence under Roman occupation, paying taxes to Caesar, to Herod, and to the temple simultaneously. But tonight, Bethlehem has been overwhelmed. Caesar Augustus has ordered a census across the entire empire, a registration of all people organized by ancestral hometown. For every descendant of King David's lineage, that hometown is Bethlehem. And they have come. From Nazareth, 90 miles north. From Jericho. From the Dead Sea villages. From every corner of Judea. Hundreds of people converging on a village built for a few hundred, arriving in waves over 3 days, each wave finding less space than the one before. The Roman census officer sits at his wooden table outside the village gate, his oil lamp guttering in the cold air, his iron stylus scratching Latin names into clay tablets that will harden overnight into permanent administrative record. 2 soldiers stand behind him in their Larica segmentata armor, red cloaks pulled tight against the Judean winter cold, their breath rising in white vapor clouds. The line of Jewish travelers waiting their turn stretches back into the darkness beyond the torchlight. They wait because they must. They resent it because they are human. And they comply because the empire has made non-compliance unthinkable. The inn, the single caravanserai that serves Bethlehem, has been full since the first day. Every floor space is occupied. People are sleeping on rooftops in the cold, on reed mats in doorways, in the street itself where someone has pulled stones from a wall to build a fire ring in the middle of the public road. The village well stands in the center square, its stone surround worn smooth by 1,000 years of daily use, the rope frayed, the wooden bucket replaced so many times no one remembers the original. Around it tonight, families marking territory with their bundles of belongings, exhausted children asleep against stone walls, men in low urgent Aramaic voices negotiating for sleeping space they cannot find. And above all of this, visible through the narrow gap between the limestone rooftops, the winter sky of the Judean highlands burns with a star field of extraordinary density. The Milky Way arcs overhead in crystalline clarity. And in the western sky, something unusual, a conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus so close together they read almost as a single brilliant object, casting faint shadows on the pale stone of the Bethlehem Ridge. Professional astronomers in Babylon and Persia have been tracking this conjunction for months. In Bethlehem tonight, most people are too cold and too tired to look up. In a cave carved into the hillside below the village, a lamp has just been lit. The distance from Nazareth to Bethlehem is approximately 90 miles as the road runs, through the Jezreel Valley, through the hills of Samaria, past the Jerusalem Junction, and south along the last limestone ridge to the village of David. On foot, leading a loaded donkey with a woman in her final weeks of pregnancy, that is a minimum of 4 days of walking. 4 days of Roman roads, military checkpoints, hostile Samaritan territory, narrow passes where bandits work the shadows between rocks, and cold winter nights in overcrowded roadside caravanserais or on open ground with nothing between your body and the Judean night but a wool cloak. The Gospel of Luke says only this: Joseph went up from Galilee, from Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David which is called Bethlehem, to be registered with Mary his betrothed, who was with child. One sentence. It contains a staggering accumulation of human suffering that the text does not explain because its first readers understood it without explanation. They had walked that road. They knew the checkpoints. They knew the passes. They knew what it meant to make that journey with a woman 9 months pregnant on a gray donkey with worn sandal leather and a leather satchel that held everything your family owned. The Roman census of Augustus was not a service to the population. It was a systematic extraction instrument. Every adult male who registered his name and property gave the empire the information it needed to calculate exactly how much it could take from him annually. The census created the tax base. The tax base funded the legions. The legions enforced the census. The circle of imperial power was complete, and ordinary people like Joseph, a carpenter from an insignificant village, had no choice but to walk 90 miles in December to feed that circle. At every Roman checkpoint, Joseph presented his genealogy scroll, the papyrus document tracing his lineage back 28 generations to King David, son of Jesse, born in Bethlehem. The Roman officer at the checkpoint examined it with Latin literate speed, found the Bethlehem lineage entry, marked his clay tablet, and handed the scroll back without ceremony. He had processed 40 of these in the last hour. The most historically significant genealogy in human civilization was examined for 12 seconds and filed in a clay tablet archive that was probably destroyed within a generation. Joseph gathered his document, adjusted the donkey's lead, and walked on. Mary's condition made every hour of this journey a genuine medical risk. In the ancient world, childbirth was the single most dangerous experience a woman could face. Estimates suggest that 1 in 4 women died in childbirth or from its immediate complications: infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labor with no surgical intervention possible. There was no midwife waiting in Bethlehem. There was no physician on the road. There was Joseph, a carpenter from Nazareth, who had never delivered a child in his life and who was about to do exactly that in a limestone cave on a cold December night. And yet Mary rode with composed endurance across every mile of that road, her hands on the donkey's neck for balance, her feet wrapped in extra wool against the cold, her face set in that particular expression of controlled interior focus that belongs to people who have decided that fear is not useful. She had been told by an angel whose appearance left her terrified that the child she carried was the Son of the Most High. That announcement, made 9 months earlier in Nazareth, had cost her everything ordinary. It had cost her the easy path of a normal betrothal and a normal life in a village where everyone knew her name. She had paid that cost already. What remained now was simply the work of the road, one step at a time, until Bethlehem appeared on the ridge ahead. When it did appear, the limestone rooftops catching the low winter sun as they crested the last hill from Jerusalem, Joseph would have felt the relief of the traveler who sees his destination. He would not yet know that arrival was only the beginning of the night's difficulties. The census crowds on the North Road were still arriving in waves. The inn was already full. Bethlehem had no room for what was coming. The village was about to become the most important address in human history, and it didn't know it, and it had no space left. The phrase has traveled through 2,000 years of Christian tradition and arrived at us softened, romanticized, made into a kind of charming hardship that set the stage for something beautiful. There was no room at the inn. 3 words. In the original Greek of Luke's Gospel, the word translated as inn is kataluma, a word that can mean a guest room, a lodging place, an upper room, a space where travelers shelter. In 1st century Bethlehem, the kataluma was almost certainly a caravanserai, a large stone building with a central courtyard where travelers and their animals shared the same ground-level floor space. There were no individual rooms. There were no beds. There was a stone floor, and you claimed your portion of it with your body and your bundles. That floor was full, not merely occupied, overwhelmed. The census had done something to Bethlehem that the village had never experienced and would never experience again. It had summoned home every descendant of David's lineage simultaneously within a 3-day registration window. Perhaps hundreds of people, converging on a village built for 300. The inn had been full since the second morning of the census. The private homes with rooms to let had been full since the first day. By the time Joseph and Mary arrived, 4 days from Nazareth at the end of the 3rd wave of travelers, the question was not which room, but whether any space existed under any roof in the entire village. Joseph asked at every door. This is what the narrative implies and what the logic of a man responsible for a pregnant woman requires. He asked at the inn. He asked at private houses where cloth strips above the door indicated lodging available. Every one of those strips had been taken 2 days earlier. The doors that opened were opened by people who were not cruel. They were genuinely overwhelmed. A pregnant woman approaching your door in first-century Judea presented a specific practical problem. A birth in your house created ritual impurity under Levitical law, requiring purification protocols that affected the entire household. In a village already under the grinding stress of Roman census enforcement, no one wanted to add that complication. The innkeeper, the only person in this narrative whose name no gospel writer recorded, made the only decision his situation permitted. His inn was at 300% of capacity. He could not create space from limestone. 120 people were sleeping on a floor designed for 40. To admit Joseph and Mary would require removing someone who had already paid and already settled. The mathematics were impossible and he knew it. But he appears to have done something that the text implies without stating. He told Joseph about the caves. He pointed south. He pointed down the hillside. He sent them in the only direction that had space. The caves below the village were not unusual shelters in first-century Judea. The limestone bedrock throughout the Judean highlands is riddled with natural and human-expanded caverns that farming families had used for livestock shelter for generations. They were warmer than the open air. The rock insulated against wind, the animal bodies within generated and held heat, the cave temperature 10 degrees warmer than the hillside outside. They smelled of what they were, working livestock shelters. Layers of compressed straw and organic matter accumulated over decades on the cave floor. Iron rings set into the walls for tethering animals. Carved limestone mangers holding hay. Joseph prepared what he could. He cleared the best corner. He spread fresh straw 4 inches deep. He laid their wool blanket over it. He lit the oil lamp and set it in the wall niche where it could burn without being knocked over. He looked at what he had built and knew, with a carpenter's honest eye for the gap between the ideal and the actual, that it was entirely inadequate and entirely the best available. Mary did not argue with the assessment. She stepped into the cave with the measured calm of a woman who had made peace with inadequacy weeks ago and replaced it with something the Latin word for which is fiat. Let it be. The birth happened in that cave as births have happened in limestone shelters across the ancient Near East for 10,000 years. Without ceremony. Without comfort. In the dark, in the cold, in the company of animals. The cry of the newborn cut through the Judean night and rose from the cave into the star-blazing sky above. In the village 50 feet above, no one heard it. The census continued. The inn slept. The world went about its business, entirely unaware that it had just changed. The Roman Empire in 4 BC spanned 2 million square miles and contained the greatest architecture the ancient world had ever produced. The aqueducts of Rome. The harbors of Caesarea Maritima. The libraries of Alexandria. The gleaming white marble of Herod's temple rising 150 feet above the Jerusalem skyline, its gold-covered accents visible on clear days from 20 miles away. Caesar Augustus, sleeping in his palace that night, governed a civilization so powerful it would not be matched for 1,000 years. He would never know that in a limestone cave in a village that barely merited a mark on his census tablets, something had entered the world that would outlast his empire by 20 centuries and still be counted. The manger was not a wooden cradle. This distinction matters. The manger described by Luke was a feeding trough carved directly into the limestone wall of the cave, ancient, worn smooth by generations of ox mouths pressing against it to reach hay, its stone surface stained brown and gray with the residue of years. Joseph lined it with what he had, fresh straw and the softest cloth from their travel provisions. Not because it was worthy of the child, because it was the only option that existed in Bethlehem that night, and the child needed to be put down somewhere while Mary recovered. The swaddling cloths were not ceremonial linen. They were strips of rough, undyed cloth from a poor family's household supply, the same cloth that served as bandage, head covering, and table surface. Wrapping a newborn in swaddling strips was standard Jewish practice in the 1st century, holding the infant's limbs close to the body for warmth and security. Mary had prepared this cloth during the pregnancy, knowing what would be needed. She wrapped her son with the precise, practiced movements of a young woman who had spent her life watching mothers in Nazareth do this work. Her hands were steady. The first visitors were shepherds. This detail, which Luke records without commentary, carries an enormous social weight that every first-century Jewish reader would have grasped immediately. Shepherds in this period were the lowest stratum of Jewish society. Men whose work made daily ritual purification impossible, who were excluded from most temple courts, whose testimony was rejected in Jewish courts of law. They were ritually unclean, professionally despised, and socially invisible. When the Gospel says the first people told about the Messiah's birth were shepherds, It is stating something deliberate and structurally radical about the nature of the kingdom this child would build. They arrived at the cave entrance in the deep of night, for rough men smelling of sheep and cold air and the residue of something overwhelming, the terror of the announcement still written on their faces and in the slight trembling of the youngest shepherd's hands. They came into the cave and found exactly what they had been told to find: a child wrapped in swaddling cloths, lying in a manger. The verification of the impossible. The lead shepherd dropped to his knees on the stone cave floor without planning to. The youngest placed a newborn lamb at the manger's edge. The only thing he owned, the most valuable thing he could give, offered with the open hands of a man who had nothing and gave it without hesitation. They left. They spread the news through Bethlehem's sleeping streets with the explosive urgency of men carrying something too large for their bodies to contain. Doors opened. People listened. Some believed. Some went to see. The old woman who had spent 70 years praying the messianic prophecies in this village, the city of David, stood at the cave mouth in the lamplight and looked at the infant in the manger with an expression not of surprise but of ancient, exhausted recognition. She had been waiting for this. She just had not expected it to arrive in a cave, through the mouths of shepherds on a census night. After the visitors had gone, the cave returned to its deep quiet. Mary held the infant, pondering. Joseph slept sitting up against the wall, his carpenter's hands folded on his knees, his face in sleep showing the true age of a man who had aged 10 years in one night. The lamp burned. The ox breathed its slow, warm breath over the manger. Outside, the stars continued their motion above the Judean hills. And in the deepest pre-dawn hour, when the planetary conjunction had nearly set in the west and the eastern horizon had not yet shown its first color, the world hung perfectly still between the event and its consequences. To understand what happened on the eastern fields of Bethlehem on the night of the birth, you first need to understand what a shepherd's life actually was in first-century Judea, not the pastoral image of gentle men in gentle countryside that 2,000 years of Christian art have constructed, but the grinding, dangerous, physically brutal reality of an occupation practiced by men classified as the lowest rung of Jewish society and who spent their nights armed with iron-studded clubs and leather slings against wolves that could destroy an unguarded flock in minutes. Shepherds in this period were officially classified as unreliable witnesses under Jewish law. Their testimony was not accepted in any court in Judea. They were deemed ritually impure. Their work involved constant contact with animal blood and death, making daily purification impossible. The temple courts in Jerusalem had sections they could not enter. The religious establishment of Israel maintained a structural institutional contempt for these men that was written into the legal and religious codes of the culture. They were, in every measurable social sense, the people least likely to be chosen as the first witnesses to anything that mattered. The Judean wolf of the first century was not a diminished modern animal. It was a full-sized Canis lupus, apex predator of the Judean hills, operating in coordinated packs, capable of taking a lamb in 4 seconds and scattering a flock in 10. The shepherd's iron-studded rod, 3 feet of hardwood with iron embedded in its striking end, was a weapon designed for close-range wolf defense. The sling beside it was not a child's toy. A trained adult male shepherd could drive a 2-inch limestone sling stone with an impact force comparable to a small-caliber projectile. You earned that accuracy over years of daily practice. It was not a skill, it was a survival requirement. The watch fire that burned on the ridge was deterrent and warmth, but it also had a critical tactical weakness. Anyone sitting beside it could see nothing beyond 20 feet into the surrounding darkness. The patrol shepherd, away from the fire, could see further but had no warmth. There was no perfect solution, only the rotation of exhausted men doing the best calculation available. On this particular night, the 4 shepherds watching the temple flock on the eastern fields of Bethlehem had been at their posts since sunset. They had eaten their barley bread and dried olives beside the fire. The youngest had completed 2 patrol circuits of the flock perimeter, finding nothing, only the darkness of the Judean winter night pressing in from all sides, and the distant amber lights of Bethlehem's census activity 400 yards to the west, and above everything the extraordinary winter star field blazing in air so clear and cold that every star burned at its maximum visible magnitude. They were tired, alert, competent, and entirely unprepared for what was about to happen. When the light came, the light Luke describes as the glory of the Lord shining around them, it came to men who were, of all people in Bethlehem that night, the best equipped to know what it was not. They were professional night watchers. They had calibrated their senses to the specific light qualities of this hillside in every weather and season. They knew moonlight, firelight, torchlight, starlight, lightning. What arrived was none of these things. It was white, focused, directional, and growing in intensity. Their fear, described in the Greek as something much closer to overwhelming terror than ordinary fright, was the documented response of trained, physically tough men to something that broke every category their experience had built. The message was specific and verifiable. A child, swaddling cloths, a manger. Not a palace. Not a wealthy house. A manger. The sign given to the lowest men in Bethlehem's social hierarchy was that the king they were being sent to see was found in the same kind of space that their animals occupied every night. They left the flock unguarded on the dark hillside, a decision that cost them real money and real professional risk, and ran down the path toward the village, guided by the single amber lamp glow in the hillside cave below Bethlehem. They found it exactly as described. They verified the impossible. They left as men transformed by verification, not believing on the basis of the announcement alone, but on the basis of seeing with their own calloused, ritually impure, legally inadmissible eyes. The lead shepherd returned to his flock in the pre-dawn dark, rounded up the scattered animals in the cold, rebuilt the dead fire alone. He sat beside it as he had sat beside it 10,000 times before. But he was not the same man, and the fire was not the same fire, and the hillside was not the same hillside, even though all three looked exactly as they always had. Dawn came to Bethlehem the way it always does in the Judean highlands in December, indifferent, precise, and beautiful in its indifference. The eastern horizon above the Moab mountains brightened from black to indigo to the first pale gold of winter sunrise. The frost on the limestone paving stones began its silent temporary melting, each ice crystal catching the low sun as a tiny prism before collapsing to a thin film of water that the stone would absorb and the morning air would evaporate within the hour. The dogs of the village shook themselves awake. The Roman day watch replaced the night watch at the gate with a brief Latin exchange. The census travelers on the rooftops stirred beneath their wool blankets and began the calculation every exhausted traveler makes at dawn. How much food remains and how long is the road home? The cave below the village still had its lamp burning. Mary had refilled the oil in the deep pre-dawn hours, her careful hands not spilling a drop, the flame steadying and brightening after the near death of the near-empty vessel. The lamp had burned through the entire night, through the birth, through the shepherd's visit, through the quiet hours of the deep night when the only sounds were animals breathing and a young woman pondering things too large for speech. It was still burning as the morning light reached the cave entrance and made the lamp's amber glow invisible against the stronger daylight. The light had changed. The lamp was still there. Somewhere to the east of Judea, in Persia or Babylon, or the Parthian territories where the astronomical traditions of the ancient world were maintained by priestly scholars of extraordinary technical sophistication, a caravan was already weeks into a journey westward. The men history calls the Magi had been tracking the planetary conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus for months before they acted on its implications. Their calculations told them that the astronomical alignment indicated a king of exceptional significance born in the Jewish territories. They were correct in their interpretation. They were months behind the event. They would arrive in Judea not on the night of the birth but sometime afterward, weeks, perhaps longer, and they would go first to Jerusalem, following the reasonable protocol that a king would be born near a capital city and a current court. That visit to Herod's palace would be the second act of this story's darkness. Herod the Great was a man who had murdered his own sons and his own wife when paranoia and the logic of absolute power demanded it. When foreign scholars arrived in Jerusalem asking where the newborn king of the Jews could be found, his response was the response of a man who had held power for 33 years in a region where every challenger was a mortal threat. He would gather his chief priests and scribes, extract the prophecy's location, Bethlehem of Judea, send the Magi to find the child, and when they did not return with the information he needed, he would send soldiers instead. The massacre of every male child 2 years and under in Bethlehem. The Holy Family warned in a dream and fled to Egypt. The children of Bethlehem not warned, not fled. This was coming. On the morning after the birth, it had not yet begun. Joseph completed the census registration. He walked up the hillside path to the village, joined the shortening queue at the Roman table, presented his genealogy scroll, gave his name, Joseph, son of Heli, Nazareth, lineage of David, and waited while the iron stylus pressed his existence into clay. One of the final entries in the Bethlehem census. The officer handed back his scroll. Done. The administrative act that had driven a 90-mile winter journey and a night in a cave was completed in 90 seconds of Roman bureaucratic efficiency. The clay tablet hardened. The empire recorded a carpenter from Nazareth. It did not record anything else about him. In the days and weeks that followed, the family found lodging in the village itself. Matthew's account of the Magi's visit describes a house, not a cave, suggesting they were settled in proper shelter by the time the Eastern scholars arrived. The cave was the first night. It was not meant to be their permanent address. But the cave is what the world remembered. The cave, the lamp, the manger, the straw, the cold stone, and the infant whose first breath had entered the Judean winter night as the most ordinary sound in the world, a newborn crying, and the most extraordinary event in the history of the world, occurring simultaneously in the same 8 seconds, indistinguishable from each other to anyone standing outside the cave listening. The shepherd on the eastern hillside rebuilt his watchfire on the second night with the same olive wood and the same stone ring. The stars came out above Bethlehem as they always did. The planetary conjunction rose again in the west, continuing its astronomical arc with the same indifference to human events that the dawn had shown. The cave below the village lit its lamp again for the second night. One small point of amber warmth in the cold limestone darkness of the Judean hills. The world did not know yet what it contained. But the world had already been changed by it, whether it knew or not, whether it would accept it or not, whether 2,000 years of argument and war and art and love and sacrifice in its name would be enough to explain it or not. In a cave in Bethlehem, in the dark reality of 4 BC, everything that followed had already begun.